Good to go. Yeah.
I have a lot of notes. Okay. So, negating's burden to prove today is that by stigmatizing hypocrisy, there's less of it happening in society, and then that by having less hypocrisy happening in society, how that is actually beneficial. Okay, what I will do for you today, give a point of setup. I will then cover my point on how destigmatized hypocrisy allows for like social change. And also like what are the harms of stigmatizing hypocrisy. And my second will be talking about she'll be on rebuttal and talking about how stigmatizing hypocrisy doesn't actually lessen your like really powerful people being hypocritical. Okay, my point of setup, who can be hypocritical? Literally anyone. Where can they be hypocritical? Literally everywhere, but it mostly happens in your day-to-day life, like on social media, for example, or literally just in person. For example, you can ask your roommate to wash the dishes, even though you're not always washing the dishes, which obviously that instantly makes you a hypocrite. Under the status quo, you're gonna like be blaming that individual for being for like an offhand comment, and like your average person could be blamed for being hypocritical. Whereas like rich people who are the most hypocritical, Theo's gonna like further expand on this, aren't actually being held that sort of accountable. Okay, on to my first point on how destigmatized hypocrisy allows for social change. Okay, well, for example, when like hypocrisy is destigmatized, people feel more comfortable like discussing issues which, if they do discuss it under the status quo, they might be deemed as a hypocrite for, say, like being very passionate about like an environmental movement, but they're not personally able to fund things like owning an electric vehicle, and then like lobbying for more people who are of a like higher socioeconomic setting to own an electric vehicle. Obviously, under status quo, they're now hypocrites, right? Whereas if they're not being like shamed and shunned for being hypocrites, they'll feel more like they have the ability to discuss these issues. More discussion in person, but also on social media, would likely lead to this like these movements growing in size, and therefore growing in strength, because you've got more people talking about it, you've got more people who feel very passionate about it, and if people are like more passionate about it and stuff, they have more lobbying power. These like social groups would have more lobbying power, because at the end of the day, like what do government and political parties care about? They care about votes. So they're more likely to be implementing like potential law changes or new forms of legislature to follow what like the majority of society feels like doing, which just doesn't really happen as much on side negating. Also, I want it to be noted that radical ideas aren't going to like gain insane traction, right? Because like radicalists are already existing in the status quo, and they likely don't care about being shunned and shamed for being hypocrites. So they already do exist. We don't necessarily get an increase of this under our side of the house. In fact, we don't think we would get any real increase.
Yeah, why?
Okay. How like going into the environmentalist movement. For a specific example. A lot of these supporters aren't super wealthy, and so it is like, yes, it's a major movement, but like a lot of them don't actually have the funds to support this, like to support these changes that they are lobbying for. Therefore, a lot of very like well-known supporters of the environmentalist movement aren't even taken that seriously, right? Because they're deemed as hypocrites, because they simply can't fund like not being okay. What are the impacts of this? Okay, well, we're going to have like more true opinions sort of being shared within society, because people don't have that constant fear of being shamed and being shunned. And also like you're maybe going to have a better democracy, because like there's going to be just more discussion on these major issues, which a lot of people feel like they can't discuss because yet again under democracy. I'll take a POI.
When Christopher Luxon had to return the $57,000 he spent on his house because it contradicted his own government's policy of not spending a lot of money, do you think that would have happened if there wasn't a stigma around hypocrisy?
Yes, because I think like at the end of the day, people are still going to be held accountable for like really crazy ideas and really crazy things that they do. Because like at the end of the day, society, people have like a moral compass in society and stuff. So this isn't like a unique benefit to stigmatizing hypocrisy, because if someone's got this really insane idea, people are likely going to still point that out, right? Okay, on to my second point on the harms of stigmatizing hypocrisy. Okay, people have morals and opinions. I think that's just a well-known fact. But they aren't necessarily able, like either physically, mentally, or financially, to sort of share or support these morals and ideas of what they believe to be an idealistic world. And also, like for the mental side, it's like fear of judgment or becoming an outcast, which is a major like preventative thing under the status quo for people discussing major issues, right? Because I mean, listen to this: you're such a hypocrite. What does that feel like? That does not make you feel like a good person. It feels hurtful because of the shame surrounding that statement. So imagine this can come from literally anyone. This can come from a friend, a parent, a co-worker, a sibling, or even a partner, right? Imagine this happens in a work setting. You're gonna like be feeling sort of feelings of anxiety of being at work, which yet again people spend a lot of time there, so they probably wouldn't want to be there. Humans are very social creatures and want to be accepted by their peers. We've got like that herd mentality of wanting to be accepted because that like makes us feel safe. So this is like lessening by stigmatizing hypocrisy. We're lessening the amount of like speaking out that's going to have and stuff. If you're like feeling stress or anxiety or regret, like you're not going to want to discuss that. Like even if you brought it up once, you're not going to really want to discuss that again, or you're not very likely to, because it's like that personal weighing of these feelings versus this moral issue, which you're likely not going to feel is like as valuable as harming your mental health, which doesn't happen under our side of the house. The impact of this are like there's going to be less discussion in society, and like I said, the increase in discussion means that there's going to be like more change or faster change or like bigger change. So if there's less discussion, there's going to be less or slower change. And also, like, people are going to feel alienated or isolated. And like I said, humans are very social creatures, so they don't want to feel like that. They don't want to feel separated from society. And I just want to reiterate that the reason these people are feeling alienated and separated from society is because, yet again, being a hypocrite is a shameful thing. And if you're being shamed for it, it's likely that other people in society don't really want to be around you or don't necessarily want to interact with you to such an extreme level. Which is super harmful to the alleged hypocrite who was either just standing up for something that they believe in, or might have just made an like accidental comment. So you're now harming like individuals, and you're not actually like the amount of shaming and stuff happening to these really powerful people like the Christopher Luxon stuff doesn't necessarily prevent as much hypocrisy and stuff even just happening in society, which Theo will further expand on. Proud side framing.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the first speaker of side Negating to come up and open their team's case today.
Apologies, I was so difficult.
As well.
Sorry.
Take your time.
I will speak as fast as possible. Oh, I can have some as well.
Yeah.
It's being important today.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, F cannot get up here and say that being called out being a hypocrite makes you feel bad and then say there is no incentive to act on that and become a better person, especially when it comes to political figures. Okay, I'm gonna come up here. I'm gonna talk about some context. Firstly, I'm gonna go over some rebuttal, go on to context and framing, then go on to our 2 main points, which is how the stigma helps hold powerful figures to account and how it improves everyday relationships. Now, firstly, on rebuttal. So one of the main points is basically about how it lessens powerful. It doesn't lessen powerful people's incentive to not be hypocritical. Note that this is a mitigatory or preemptive point here. They have nothing to prove on the comparative. There's still going to be hypocritical, powerful people on their side of the house. But what the difference is that, okay, although there are some powerful people who don't have accountability measures, which exist on both sides of the world, like authoritarian figures, like dictators, who will just be hypocritical either way, there are people who do have accountability measures, who rely on things like, for example, the religious leaders and their congregations, like democratic leaders and their voters, celebrities and their fans who will notice this hypocrisy and who will act on it, and it creates an incentive for that. I will go more about that in our main point. On the second point about climate change and social justice, people care a lot about things like climate change, and they understand that we can't do things like go out and buy a $60,000 Tesla. The incentive, but like the unique difference in this is that now with hypocrisy, now that hypocrisy is destigmatized, we no longer have the ability to criticize people who are actually hypocritical, who are actually virtue signaling, and do not actually act on this. They say they care about the environment. Maybe they're Taylor Swift and taking 60 different private jet flights a year, who aren't acting on this. Okay, now I'm going to move on to some quick context and framing. Firstly, what does the stigma look like? People have a moral judgment on hypocrisy. It's bad to be a hypocrite. Secondly, people call out others for things they perceive to be hypocritical. We both agree on this. And thirdly, the stigma is often transmitted to people when they're young, like saying things like "don't be a hypocrite," like to your siblings, etc. It's something your teacher tells you, like to be morally consistent with your words and action. Note that the stigma mostly applies to cases of hypocrisy where it's bad. Why is this true? Well, if you do something good, but maybe you say something contradictory, the fact that you've actually done something good is better than any words that you may have said. And just like on the second point of context and framing, a stigma around hypocrisy doesn't mean that every time somebody changes their mind or maybe changes a political view, that someone treats them horribly and bullies them. Why is this true? 3 things. People recognize their own actions aren't 100% consistent. They don't want to set a bar that they can't reach themselves. It's unironically hypocritical to do so. Secondly, we generally understand that people's worldview changes and develops over time because it is something we experience ourselves. We have empathy with that. We know that we do this ourselves. Thirdly, even if you don't buy this, people don't have a catalogue of everything everyone else does. So it's like not reasonable to say that you're going to be criticizing everyone on everything they say. Or on the comparative, just for like celebrities and stuff, we do actually have that catalogue of what they have been saying. Same thing with politicians, but I'll discuss this more. So what does the world without this stigma look like? Well, there's just going to be more people buying into hypocrisy, and there's just naturally more people are going to engage in it. Okay, on to our first point, which is how stigma around hypocrisy holds influential figures to account. What is the context of this? The level of scrutiny that a powerful person is like held account to is more than the everyday person. And quickly before I go on, I'll take a POI.
If people are being shamed because of their opinions that they voice, like why are they likely to feel that they're safe to do it again or to continue?
I think people shame people for different opinions anyway, in the status quo. It has nothing to do with your hypocritical or not. If you just really hate someone's political opinion, you're going to shame them. I don't see how that's exclusive to hypocrisy. Again, I've already rebutted why it's not the case when it comes to social justice with in my rebuttal. But I'll continue with my point. Firstly, I'll just on some mechanisms. Why this is true. We care about the people who have control over our lives, religious figures and politicians. We perceive these, and secondly, we perceive these people as moral figures, which means we hold them to a higher standard of account. And thirdly, uniquely, there is a catalogue of these people's interactions through media, etc. Now, Why do we think that the stigma holds them to a higher standard and why is this good? Well, firstly, it means that there are real consequences for them if they preach something in their public life and do something in their private life. Again, the Christopher Luxon example, and just some more rebuttal in here. This was not something entirely crazy. He is entitled to get this $57,000 as the head of government. The difference is it is hypocritical to what he preaches, and that and just the stigma alone just generates more power through mechanisms like the media that wouldn't have happened elsewise and may have not caused the change we see in general. And on to the second mechanism, which is like the deterrent effect. The fact that there is consequences means that people avoid being hypocritical in the first place. This just looks like a church leader actually donating his money to charity when he says that he's going to do that. Thirdly, a stigma against hypocrisy helps and reinforce ideas of truthfulness and transparency within a democracy now that leaders are actually doing what they say they're going to do more often. And fourthly, hypocrisy is something that has a low barrier to entry. People can see when Christopher Luxon is being hypocritical. What this means is that people can buy into it when they understand that there's stigma around it. People buy into it, get behind it. They rally behind politicians being hypocritical, especially when it comes to things like the media pointing this out to them. Now, what are the outcomes of this? Powerful figures, politicians, celebrities, and religious figures have to better conduct themselves in a way which reflects what they say. The incentive to preach good things exists in either worlds because people, that's how you actually get support. The difference is uniquely stigma around hypocrisy means you have to follow your own word if you want to keep this support. On the highest level, again, this is religious leaders who donate their money now and politicians that follow through with what they say. And on the lower level, it just looks like celebrities supporting other social justice causes. If they supported Ukraine, they now support and donate to Palestine. And some weighting here. This holds a lot of weight in the debate because people are influenced by, these influential people. It's in the name, right? This has flow-on effects. Now on to our second point, which is basically just how the stigma benefits people in day-to-day interactions. Firstly, people who are perceived to be hypocritical, you're not friends with them, right? There's a stigma around it. They're going to backstab you, right? And this means that for your social life, there is a strong incentive for you to not be a hypocrite and you to be, treat others how you want to be treated. On the comparative, because there are more hypocritical people in the other world, because it's destigmatized, because parents aren't telling their children not to be hypocrites, you're more likely to be friends with people who will backstab you. And there's just a lot of emotional trauma and emotional harms that come from that. Secondly, family relationships, a parent can't spend 10 hours on their phone and then tell their kids to don't spend 10 hours on their phone, right? It just, sorry. Tell their kids not to spend a lot of time on their phone. It enables accountability measures for parents to, be a better influence on their kids. And thirdly, increases trust in relationship because now you trust your friends more and think your interactions are genuine. And this may sound like a low intake, but when you apply this to the 8 billion people in the world who now have more genuine friendships, who now just have more real, meaningful relationships with people. This is a really big impact. What does this mean? Effectively, the quality of people's interpersonal relationships are better. And in the best case, the badness you feel from being called out is temporal, whereas the friendships we have last forever. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the second speaker of side Affirmative to come up and continue their team's case today.
Also, just take a second to set up my papers.
Yeah, but that's good, right?
I would like to begin by making some rebuttals about what the Negating team said, namely about Taylor Swift, about the impact of being called out for hypocrisy, and actually a lot of the rest of their content I'm going to rebut in my substantive point, which is about how stigma doesn't affect those most likely to abuse hypocrisy. To begin, on Taylor Swift, this is happening in a world where hypocrisy is stigmatized. People who virtue signal like this, as well, are less likely to feel the impacts of stigma. They're less likely, we believe, to value that sort of social faux pas. And so we believe that stigma will have a more significant effect on people who are genuinely trying to do better. And yes, once again, it's happening under the status quo, under side negating. Additionally, we would like to say, you are a hypocrite. How does that make you feel? As you have said, this will result in social isolation and loss of friendship, and thus, we believe, poor mental health for people accused of hypocrisy. Additionally, because of this stigma, it's simply not a nice thing. There is no way to politely call someone out for being a hypocrite, the way that you seem to be insinuating. And now I'm going to move on to my substantive point about how stigma doesn't affect those most likely to abuse hypocrisy. Specifically, I want to talk about megachurch pastors who, for example, preach about sharing, the evils of wealth, giving your last copper to the less fortunate. After Sunday sermon, they get in private jets to go to the Bahamas for the week. Their hypocrisy allows them to take money from people who are trying to spread goodness, do charity, and make positive impacts in the world to fund their house's indoor swimming pools. Similarly, we see this, or a similar thing with politicians lying. Whenever politicians lie, they, no, sorry, I lost myself. Oh yes, politicians lie even with stigma. For example, in the US, Biden preached heavily about the environment, about hanging around for the long haul, and then approved a massive oil drilling project, the Willow Project in Alaska. And while he got some flack for this online, it still went through. He is still the Democratic candidate for their elections later this year. The stigma resulted in no substantive or measurable change. This stigma is social, and those who are above many other social rules are above this one too. And so thus we see that it is less likely to make any change among wealthy and powerful people, and is far more likely to negatively impact everyday people, which is what we believe this debate is about. Again, stigma is proven to be incapable of stopping this mass-scale hypocrites as they currently exist under status quo. And in fact, this applies to all incredibly wealthy people. No one can hold them accountable on either side of the house, really. Stigma can only influence and impact everyday people who at worst are hypocritical about dishes and jean jackets, and are at best hypocritical while advocating for social change that they themselves are not in the position to enact. And once more, the stigma on everyday people results in anxiety, low self-esteem, overall poor mental health due to social ostracization, social isolation, and gossip. I will take a POI. Thank you.
Are politicians above their social opinions of their electorates?
Are politicians above the social opinions of their electorates? Well, for small things like this, oftentimes they can be. For example, my example in the US, while many of the Democratic voters strongly feel about environmental issues, they are currently in a bit of a lesser evil situation. And so many people who actually specifically were the loudest critics of Biden during this move, calling him out for his hypocrisy, are still planning on voting for him this November, because the hypocrisy has significantly less power when dealing with the powerful.
You know what?
Yes.
Do you not acknowledge that in the US there is literally only one other main presidential candidate, and that is Trump, and that is probably a big incentive for people to still vote for Biden despite his hypocrisy?
Well, that's what we're saying. The stigma of hypocrisy isn't able to change what Biden is planning on doing in terms of the environment, in terms of the Willow Project. It's not able to sway that opinion, and it's not able to stop people from going to the Met. It's not able to stop, what's the university that's currently going through it? Stop people sending lots of funding to Israel to further the war in Palestine. It's actually, cries of hypocrisy have very limited effects, and thus we see more that it influences day-to-day small social interactions. Because again, everyone is a hypocrite at some point in their lives. There is no possible way that you can 100% maintain your opinions throughout your entire life. And especially with the internet, where you can look back and see people's past opinions and ideas that they may have moved on from. We believe that there are many, again, everyday people who are being called out for hypocrisy, and it's negatively influencing them socially, mentally, and that is why I'm proud to stand affirming.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the second speaker of side Negating to come up and continue their team's case today.
Second F spends most of their speech trying to mitigate our material on powerful people, but they don't actually have a pathway to victory here, right? If all they can say is people will be hypocritical in both worlds, at their very best case, that entire point becomes a wash. I'll prove to you why it doesn't. But they only have one real pathway to victory in this debate, and that's people's interpersonal relationships. I'm going to prove to you why we win there too. 3 things to do in my speech then. Firstly, 2 notes on framing. Secondly, I'm going to flip the order of the points and start with people's interpersonal relationships because that's our strongest material. And then lastly, I'll finish up on powerful people and why that's an independent pathway to victory for us. Okay, firstly on framing. What is the counterfactual, or what does it actually look like when people stigmatize you for being a hypocrite? I want to note a contradiction in F's case, right? They tell you firstly that people are going to become so ostracized, their relationships are going to be so terrible, right? But they also tell you that like everyone is a hypocrite. I think if everyone is a hypocrite, the incentive to literally never talk to someone again or just to bully them until they're like desperately sad for being a hypocrite is very low. We tell you 3 reasons, right? At Sam, firstly, because that sets you the bar for yourself so high, you probably don't want to set a bar you think you can't meet. But secondly, people have empathy for change. You know that your opinions have changed. Unclear why you just think nobody else can change ever. But thirdly, and pretty intuitively, you don't have a catalogue of everything that everyone has said. I don't know every single thing Sam has said in his life to hold him to account for being hypocritical, right? It's just not very feasible. But I think what is most likely then is it exists on a spectrum of how badly you call people out for being hypocritical. I think if your roommate didn't wash the dishes and they're telling you to, you're probably just oh, can you stop being hypocritical and wash the dishes for once in your life? I don't think that makes them feel that mad, right? But everyday people can also do things that are bad, right? It's pretty unclear to me why everyday people should be totally immune to being called out for being hypocritical, for feeling bad about being hypocritical, when they can do things that are bad, right? And I think the last thing to note here is that even at the very best, this alienation is temporary, because if you are alienated, that's a really strong incentive to change and to no longer be hypocritical. Because note that hypocrisy is not a biological trait. You don't have to be a hypocrite, right? Okay, I think think what that means is that it's just very unlikely that people are like so terribly ostracized that their lives are ruined, right? And I think because we live in a world where people are called out for being hypocrites all the time, do you actually have a relationship that was totally ruined by that? Probably not, right? I think we need to be a lot more reasonable about what that world really looks like. I'll take a POI before I move on.
Would being accused of hypocrisy not negatively impact you emotionally?
For like 5 minutes, if someone calls you out for like not doing the dishes, maybe I feel bad for 5 minutes. Maybe I just do the dishes to shut them up. I think that's probably a good thing, right? But the more you're called out for being hypocritical, the higher the emotional impact of that is, the worse that suggests your hypocrisy is, right? And I'm going to get into that right now, actually, on personal relationships, because I'm going to add some standard contribution here on toxicity, right? I think stigma around hypocrisy is a huge part of what allows us to like emotionally abusive relationships, right? It's like your partner goes out to the bar all the time and you can't even go out for coffee with your friends. Look, without a stigma around hypocrisy, maybe these things are bad, but you can just be like, oh, he loves you a lot. He just wants to like protect you, right? It is the double standard that you can take to your friends as evidence for somebody like literally being abusive to you. It's that double standard that they can highlight and be like, you need to get out of that relationship, right? That is a totally exclusive benefit to our side. And know that if you only think this occurs in like a very small minority of cases, because it's just so high impact, right? And because emotionally abusive relationships have the potential to escalate to become physically abusive ones if you don't get out of there, I think that's something that you have to weigh very highly. I think we need to get a lot of work on that from A. I think the other things to note in this personal relationship point is, like what we tell you about family, right? I think it's really important that your parents aren't hypocritical. I think that stigma makes them not be hypocritical, right? We hear that example from like phone use at Sam. And the reason this is so important to debate is because like kids copy their parents, right? Just because your parents say something doesn't mean you believe it. But when they do it, that's when you model your behavior. You become a person like your parents. I think that's also really high impact. I think what you then need to believe at the end of personal relationships is it's probably just better if people do get called out for being a hypocrite, because in minor cases, their lives aren't ruined. But in the cases where they are genuinely called out to quite a high degree, it's because they're doing bad things, right? I have no idea why Ash wants you to think that people who are being hypocritical can't just be wrong, can't just be deserving of being called out, right? I think at the end of this, they probably don't have a pathway to victory in this debate, but let me talk secondly then on powerful people. Their strongest or like most responsive material here is what they tell you about climate change and like Taylor Swift. But I think two things. Firstly, people care a lot about things like the climate. I think the fact that you think there's like an imminent existential crisis probably overrides your incentive to care about hypocrisy when you like use a reusable coffee cup but also have like a petrol car, right? Because you probably understand that it's just like more high stakes. But what you tell the unique difference is that people who would otherwise only virtue signal are compelled to act. Look, they tell you that Taylor Swift hasn't acted. Okay, that's fine. That doesn't mean that other people haven't acted, right? Because they don't want to be called out for virtue signaling. I think there are heaps of people who are like chronically online and really afraid of that and actually do change their actions, right? I think the other thing to note here is they've set the analytical bar for themselves very high under this point. They want you to think that individual actions are going to solve climate change, right? If we don't have the stigma around hypocrisy, I don't think they meet that burden because it's just very high. What is much easier to prove is the way this impacts the actions of individual powerful people. Because note that Act wants you to believe under this social impact point that people are so ostracized, but that it has no impact on the powerful. But I give you that POI, right? If people care so much about hypocrisy that they're willing to ostracize you, I think they care so much about hypocrisy that they're willing to take their vote away. Look, sure, maybe it doesn't matter in the US, which is like a two-party system and you have literally no other choices. But in like lots of other countries where you have lots of choices, like for example, New Zealand, I think it matters a lot, right? Because electorates get mad. And know that we tell you that it's also very easy for people who aren't politically active to buy into hypocrisy, because that's an easy thing to see that you think is wrong, right? You think it's wrong for politicians to lie. You don't trust them because you think if they were hypocritical about that, what are they going to do when they get in power? Maybe I won't vote for them, right? I think that electoral influence is really strong to stop bad people from getting into office, but also to make politicians be more morally consistent, especially because of the power of media scrutiny. Like, sure, maybe politicians lie, but what AF actually need to do is they prove that they lie less, they are less hypocritical when there's no stigma. I think that's pretty counterintuitive, right? And look, even if you don't believe that there is an electoral mechanism here, I think there's a different one, and that is the internal relationships within your party, right? That looks like David Clark, like preaching about like following the COVID restrictions and then getting turfed because he like went to the like beach or whatever during COVID and broke the restrictions himself. This hypocrisy thing is something that allows parties to get rid of MPs, to get rid of members who are behaving in ways that are contradictory to their party, that are hypocritical, right? I think that's a really good thing because it improves the consistency of the way that parties act. That's super important. That's a different accountability mechanism that doesn't rely on the actual way that the electorate votes. It can even apply in things like American politics where you don't have a choice really between who you're voting for. I think last thing to note here is what we tell you on religious figures. They tell you about super mega pastors do bad things anyway, but they also donate 5% of their income, right? Whoever the guy is who runs Destiny Church does donate 5% of his income to charity without the stigma around hypocrisy. Maybe he just donates 0% of his income to charity. Look, even if it's 5% of his income, that's just very intuitively a lot better than 0%. I think the thing that you need to know at the end of this point is that they haven't met the burden to prove a difference to climate change. What is actually realistic in this debate is that powerful figures act, even if only marginally better, they act better. I think that's probably debate winning.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the third speaker of side proposition to come up and close off a substantive portion of their chief's case.
Oh no, I missed that percent. Hang on.
People in society are constantly being emotionally harmed because of things they say that they might not actually mean, accidentally say, now they're emotionally damaged for the next month at least, right? So if you go into these scenarios, maybe you don't want to actually voice your opinions. Maybe you don't want to talk about how you're really feeling to your coworkers. That's really harmful because it affects you. It affects the everyday person. And we actually see big harms from this one point. What am I going to do for you in my speech today? 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the impacts on social relationships and the average person. Secondly, on abusive relationships and toxicity. And thirdly, on politicians and powerful figures. Okay, so firstly, on social relationships. We heard from Second about how all hypocrites, everyone's a hypocrite, so therefore not everyone can be socially outcast because obviously we all have friends, right? I've got 4 responses here. Firstly, you feel pressures from a certain group, so it doesn't necessarily have to be towards a whole society, right? If you do it online, maybe it's you're really conscious about what you're saying online. If you do it in your workplace, maybe it's you're really conscious about what you're doing in your workplace. That's not the same to a group of friends, and even if it is, it's it goes into your specific time frame, right? So obviously this emotional harm wears off after a while, right? But even that period of a month or 2 months can be so harmful because it actually means you can't voice what you're really feeling in your society, and it makes you feel so degraded and so pointed out. Just saying that you're a hypocrite is actually really harmful, especially if it's somebody who you actually care about saying it to you. That alone can make you just feel so bad for such a long time. Secondly, we heard about you can't be friends with people because you're just going to be backstabbed by hypocritical people. Firstly, I think it's actually the hypocrites that are getting all this backlash, right? So even if you're not going to be friends with people because you're scared they're all going to be hypocrites, we've talked to you about this through the whole debate. We've said that everyone is a hypocrite at least once in their life, even accidentally. So really, this is not actually going to change. You can't just be afraid because of somebody who's going to say this one thing in your life. And secondly, Actually, these hypocritical people are going to be the ones being harmed, not their friends, right? Because their friends are like, you're such a hypocrite. And then they are the ones feeling that emotional damage. And secondly, it just leads to poor mental health for the entire group. If you're constantly afraid that everyone's a hypocrite and you're like, I can't actually tell them that. It's not something that I can voice my opinion about because this is like, it's not stigmatized. I can't actually say that's a bad thing and that I disagree with it. Next we heard about like people want to change. I think this is good, right? People want to change on either side of the house. If they say something they don't really agree with or like they want to get better knowledge on a subject, even if somebody calls out that they're a hypocrite, they probably want to change, right? But what we actually see is this time they actually feel shamed. So what they are not doing is they are not promoting their own mental health and the change that they actually want to make for a certain amount of time. This actually lessens the amount of change they want to get instead of someone like trying to figure out how this actually is going to be like better for them, right? So on our side of the house, we see people are actually trying to help each other and like get a better point of view instead of like actually just going like, I'm not going to talk to you about that. That's terrible. You shouldn't say that, right? And lastly, on this point, we heard like people are politically active and will buy into hypocrisy, right? And this kind of ties into my bit about politicians that I'll talk about later. And it's like, if a politician lies, they probably won't get votes, right? So if a politician is like, I'm going to give, you should all donate to charity. That's great. They donate like nothing. They're probably not going to get loads of votes anyway. So like, even if it's not stigmatized really heavily and you don't get this backlash from the public that's like giant, you're probably just not going to get a good like social look anyway, even if it's like not as big as the stigmatized thing, right? Okay, I will take a POI before I go back.
Isn't the reason that people condemn the example you just gave because there's a stigma around hypocrisy?
I think it just looks bad if people like don't donate to charity or like don't do good things, right? So even if you're not like being super hypocritical about it, if you're like just not doing good things in general, then they're just not going to look good to the public. So next on to like my bit about abusive relationships. This is what we heard from the second, and it came out kind of late in today's debate. So we heard like if people are like super hypocritical in abusive relationships, and this is like limiting someone's ability to do things, right? So firstly, it's like harder to call out abusive behavior. So like if we can't say hypocrisy is really bad, then in these abusive relationships, which will happen on either side of the house, it's super hard to stop that hypocrisy because people don't actually feel like it's a bad thing, right? So if you're told like you can't go out to a bar, then that's like other people will look at it and it's like hypocrisy you can't think is bad, or like you don't have that stigma. Like it's just not going to be looked at by public in a way that like you can see it properly, and you can't actually look at it from an outsider's point of view and like examine it super thoroughly and like look at it in that way. And it actually prevents people from like pointing it out from an outsider's point of view. Lastly, onto like the bit about politicians and powerful people. So we heard like powerful people have more scrutinizing power. This is true, but they don't care about what the average person is saying. We heard from Theo a beautiful example about like how Joe Biden wasn't going to listen to the average person because the average person didn't want this thing getting passed, right? These people have so much money, they have so much power that if a small group of people on social media are like, we don't agree with this, they're just not going to care, right? So even if they are being called out because hypocrisy is bad, even if they are being called out for this, the average person doesn't like actually have much effect on these large corporations, which means they're just going to be hypocritical on either side of the house. This doesn't actually like change people. And Theo elaborated this beautifully in her point. So I'm not going to say anything more about that because Theo did it really well. Secondly, like we heard about how people care about who has power over our lives. This is 100% true, but just as I said, this doesn't mean that rich people are actually going to care about the average person's life. So if we look at a politician, just because people don't want the politicians to do this certain thing, doesn't mean the politicians aren't going to do it because they don't actually see what life is like for the average person. They don't really care about like it beyond the point where they're going to vote for them, right? So we actually see they're not getting the same point of view. And we heard the Bahamas example from Theo, right? So we actually see that these rich people don't really care about like what happens beyond what they see as in like the major voting stuff. So they actually don't care about what happens beyond the point where they're like, oh, they won't see this. This isn't actually that bad. So yeah.
what have I done for you in my speech today? I've proved that like the emotional harm from the social relationships is probably the biggest thing in today's debate, because these people are feeling shunned. They cannot actually voice their opinion. This is lasting effects, can last for a long period of time, and is really important in today's debate. Secondly, I've touched on like abusive relationships and how we actually can't point out how hypocritical people are being if we can't actually see it, right? And thirdly, on like politicians and rich people, how we can't actually see what they're doing and like the way in which the average person cares about this, right? So what we actually see is people who cannot afford to weigh their morals above what people are telling them to do. They cannot actually survive, and they're struggling to actually say what they want to say in society. That is why side affirming.
I don't think I need 3, guys. Look, I think I'm unwilling to buy in this debate that what matters to you more as an individual is occasionally your friends being mean to you and telling you that you're a hypocrite versus, your partner being toxic, being hypocritical towards you in your day-to-day life, and you having no real mechanism to, adjust to this. Okay, so 2 main things to do in my speech. Firstly, around wider societal change, and then secondly, on interpersonal relationships / individuals. So in wider societal change, what does our world look like here, right? We tell you about a unique accountability mechanism for those in power, especially, right, and this is key here, for those who are politically uneducated, right? This is a point that is largely unresponded to by the affirmative side, and we think it's pretty big. Why? Because if your politician who's in charge of your country is committing some kind of weird, subjective political tax fraud thing, a lot of people who aren't very highly educated either won't know what that is or won't be engaging in the right forums to understand it. But if they see somebody blatantly saying one thing and doing the other, the stigma around hypocrisy gives them a very easy mechanism to respond to this, right? So this is pretty big. We also tell you in our world about intra-party cleaning and electorate changes, right, within parties, right? Note that there's really no response to this from third. Right, that means you have to buy, really, that in our world, our parties are more internally consistent. This is really good for democracy, because as a voter, you are getting what you vote in, right? You're not getting parties that have internal discord going on. You are getting exactly what you put on the ballot. App's world here is really that people are unwilling to share their beliefs and be, so activists. No thanks, not yet. For fear of shame. They tell you about less discussions, they'll get more discussions because apparently people won't discuss if they feel like they'll be shamed. And that people in power are above such social rules and therefore they don't affect them. Okay, 3 main responses here. Firstly, how do we hold people, sure, yeah, before I start my responses.
So are you claiming that presently there is no inter-party conflict in political parties?
No, of course I'm not claiming that, because that would be stupid. What I'm saying is, if we didn't have the stigma around hypocrisy, there would be way, way more, right? Because it would be way easier to be a hypocrite, and that inherently makes you less consistent. I feel like that's pretty clear. Firstly, how do we hold people in power accountable? Because we do have to, right? Otherwise, really, really bad things happen, such as authoritarian regimes. Okay, so the first one is the law, right? The law is relatively inconsistent in a lot of cases, right? And a lot of people, as I've said, don't really understand it, and therefore can't use law and politics as a mechanism to engage with these people. So secondly, we turn to things like social protests, right? People on social media marching with placards and things, to express their opinions about these people, right? What we see is this is a huge benefit here for people in low socioeconomic groups and things, right? Which is yet again unresponded, right? This looks like, again, the example of Christopher Luxon, right? Doing a thing that he's completely legally allowed to do, taking the $50,000 for a house that he already owns, right? But there's nothing legally wrong with that, but it's obviously wrong, right? We think it's wrong because it's hypocritical, right? That gives people an avenue to respond to that and therefore get better outcomes for themselves, right? Secondly, why is a climate activist unlikely to face shame for something like, for instance, not being able to afford an EV? This is a pretty big sort of mechanism for the affirmative side as to how they think people will be less involved in protests. I feel like people will pretty reasonably buy if you are really, really poor and you can't buy an EV. That doesn't mean that you are a terrible hypocritic person, right? If you are still poor and you are doing your best to be a climate activist, right? That probably people are not going to think you're a terrible hypocritical person because you can't afford a Tesla. I think that's pretty obvious. All right. Thirdly, I feel like in terms of there's this point around how if politicians lie, they won't get votes, right? But I feel like there's an important distinction between hypocrisy and lying. Again, with the Christopher Luxon example, he wasn't lying, right? Again, if you point to things like a lot of institutions in America where they're not telling lies, but there is inherent hypocrisy with how they present themselves as a nation and how they deal with socioeconomic harm, right? So in terms of the end of this clash, the way here is this is a huge, unique path to victory for us, right? AF doesn't really try to claim better institutional change on their side. Rather, they try to mostly claim that we can't achieve it because these people are above these kinds of social rules, right? So I think if we can prove that we change even 20% of important political figures' minds, you have to buy that that's a really, really big impact, right? The men here, I think that then it's really unstrategic for AF to ignore this huge benefit. And then AF's only benefit that they try to claim here about is significantly less protest and discussion and things. They don't meet the analytical bar for it because they cannot prove that protests are significantly harmed because people are scared that someone in the crowd might call them a hypocrite for saying something slightly different than they did 3 months ago, right? And at the end of this class, powerful people derive their power from public support, right? This is true for religious leaders, this is true for presidents, prime ministers, wherever you point to, right? These people need the public to be on their side, to remain in these places of power. And if the public have a unique weapon to fight against them and their injustice, this is incredibly valuable, right? And we could win the debate just off of that. But then secondly, on interpersonal relationships and individuals, right? In our world, we tell you that trust and consistency are key to friendships. This is pretty clear, right? It's pretty clear that if you're being a hypocrite less of the time, you're going to be more consistent and therefore have more trust and more powerful friendships. We tell you these huge points about hypocritical toxic relationships as well and how we provide unique avenues for you to get out of them, right? In their world, you essentially, the main crux of their argument here is that people are told that they're a hypocrite all the time and they feel really sad and psychologically harmed by this, right? And then this leads to people feeling that they can't express themselves and larger psychological damage. Okay, 4 responses here. Firstly, I don't really see why being told that you're a hypocrite is any more impactful to your psyche than any other insult your friend could give you. If you're in that situation where you're flatting with your mate and he comes up and tells you that your hair is looking really terrible today or really hates the way you play football, I don't really buy why being told you're a hypocrite is such a demoralizing thing in comparison to all these other things a person can say to you that is that important. So I think that point doesn't really matter. Secondly, why is not being able to express yourself intangible? I feel like a majority of the things that normal people say throughout their day-to-day are consistent with who they are generally. Most people, if they change their mind on major political things, they are changing their mind throughout the course of their life, right? And in terms of things like washing the dishes, I feel like that's not a significant psychological harm. I feel like you have a 5-minute argument with your roommate and you drop a little star chart and then you sort that out relatively quickly. I don't see that as a big impact. Thirdly, I think being conscious about what you say to avoid negative attention, which AF claims is a negative, is in fact a huge benefit. Why? Because I feel like if people are being more conscious about what they say online, even if it is to avoid stigma, is generally good because people are being less annoying, they're being less terrible people, right? I feel like that is absolutely a benefit here, right? So we can just flip that for our side. We appreciate that very much. Fourthly, responses to toxic relationships aren't sufficient here. The stigma for toxic relationships is the mechanism for identifying these situations, whether you're in them. Maybe it's the difference from looking at your partner and thinking, oh, he really loves me, he's just a bit troubled, and he's actually causing me serious harm. Or maybe it's somebody on the outside having that same thought process looking in. Either way, right, there's still not enough of an analytical burden proven from the affirmative side as to how they can solve these things on their side without this stigma of hypocrisy. And because this is such a high impact for these people, it's a situation that they may not even be able to escape. We think this is huge. So at the end of this class, this is obviously AF's strongest material, right? It's the material they whip the most. However, I feel like it is still less important to the debate than the stuff about larger politicians and, institutions and things like that. Why? Because I feel like one politician's behavior affects way more people than Jerry from South Dunedin, right? So I feel like also here, AF doesn't really prove why our framing on how hypocrisy works doesn't stand, right? What is our framing on hypocrisy? Just to whip it again. We tell you that people are going to be called hypocrites for being inconsistent and doing something good because largely that's not how people calling out people with hypocrisy works, right? That has pretty much never happened in the history of the world, right? Therefore, the stigma is largely only going to affect negative actions rather than positive actions, right? We still have benefits, therefore, for these people in vulnerable places, and the idea that you can't be an activist because you're scared of people being mean to you for your hypocrisy is not a sufficient response to that, and that's why I'm very proud to negate. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. Now, as is customary, we will reverse the speaking order for leaders' replies. So I invite the leader of side Negating to come up and close off their team's case today.
Ev called me a hypocrite about 20 minutes ago, and I haven't sustained any lasting emotional harm. 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, on framing. Secondly, on personal relationships. No, I'm going to explain to you why this isn't the most significant thing in the debate, but I'm going to start with it to take at their best case. And then lastly, on social change. Okay, the most important thing to clarify is when do we call out hypocrisy and what does that look like? We tell you that you call out hypocrisy when it's bad. We give you literally 4 reasons for this, just to remind you, because you set the bar too high for yourself, because people have empathy for the fact that people change, because it's just really hard to track every instance that might be potentially contradictory in every person you interact with. And that when you do good things, that overrides hypocrisy, right? Your actions speak louder than your words. I think that's pretty intuitive. I think what that means at the end of the debate is it's reasonable to believe that how bad you're called out for your hypocrisy is proportional to how harmful that hypocrisy is. Maybe you make just an offhand comment to your mate because they don't do the dishes. I don't think you get lasting emotional damage, right? But when you scale it up with the power of social media, when you scale it up to people who are as influential as powerful figures, that's when the pressure to not be a hypocrite becomes really overwhelming. Okay. Let's start then with personal relationships. I think note that because most actions you have in your personal relationships aren't just heinously bad, the amount to which you're called out for being hypocritical probably isn't that harmful, right? So 4 things probably stand at the end of this bit. Firstly, that stuff we told you about parents modeling behavior, that had no response. I think even if you think it's kind of marginal, because everybody has parents who raise them, I think it's pretty important that you model good behavior from your parents and aren't just told to do good things. I think secondly, on abusive relationships, the response that we heard wasn't sufficient because like Shay told you, it is the stigma that makes you on the lookout for those sorts of emotional harms. And note that at second, I told you why this is so high stakes, right? Because even if the warning sign of slight hypocrisy, right, about who can go out at night and who can't, about who can have male friends and who can't, is becomes a warning sign for things that can be far, far worse down the track. And the worst case, it literally is just relationships that are massively physically abusive. And there's even a slight chance that we get people out of those relationships sooner on our side. That's a massive benefit. It's probably the highest stake thing within this personal relationships point. I think thirdly, we tell you that you just have better talk to your friends if you don't feel like they're crazy hypocrites. But lastly, you just don't be a bad person, right? Because Av tells us you're going to be conscious of what you say. Like Shay tells you, because we've proven to you that you call out hypocrisy when it's bad, if you're being conscious not to say bad things, that's a massive benefit. If you want to give the debate on personal relationships, I think you should give it on the fact that now people say less shitty things. I think that's super awesome, right? But let's talk secondly on social change. And know that this is the most high impact thing in the debate because it's how people's lives change in the most significant way. I think on the climate change material and people's adherence to their belief systems, the incentive for people who really care about things like climate change probably doesn't change, right? I think it's pretty unreasonable to assume that people don't protest because they're afraid of being called a hypocrite because they also have a car that runs on gas, right? I think the difference then was that virtue signalers are more likely to be held accountable because in order to get that social clout for being a really cool climate change activist, you also have to follow through. I think that was really important, right? But if you think that's a wash, what becomes the most important is how politics and religious figures change. We tell you 3 things. Firstly, on electoral incentives, I don't think that's sufficiently mitigated, especially if people care so much about about hypocrisy, right? But secondly, on internal party stability, this was really important and had literally 0 response. Lastly, I think just want to note that the best case responses here are just oh, people will be hypocritical, people will do bad things on either side. But like I told you at second, if the difference is Brian Tamaki choosing to donate 10% of his income to charity so he can justify telling his followers to donate money to his church and him just not doing that and telling his followers to donate to his church, I think that's 10% more money we get for charity. Multiply that across all the mega pastors in the world. That sounds like a pretty awesome benefit to me.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the leader of side Affirmative to close off today's debate.
Thank you. I've identified like two main points of clash within this debate. Who's affected or affected more severely by stigmatized hypocrisy, and then also how effective stigmatized hypocrisy is. Okay, so side negating's like main path to victory was on relationships and like how this holds really powerful people to account, right? How stigmatized hypocrisy holds really powerful people to account. I think Theo's like substantive point was a pretty great explanation of how under the status quo we're not actually holding these like really strong and powerful people to account to any real extreme like levels. I think her example of mega churches and how pastors and stuff abuse their position of power is a really great example. I also thank Side Negating for providing us the example of under the status quo, a celebrity like Taylor Swift is frequently flying and like so many carbon emissions, right? It's insane. So like this happens under the status quo. Yes, she's being scrutinized, but it's not changing the behavior at all. So I think they've like perfectly proven how that doesn't work. Also, we've like proven how stigma really harms social relationships. Side Negating's trying to say like, oh, it's a minor emotional harm. However, like if you're not accepted in your social circle, it's obviously very damaging to you emotionally. And that could be because you have a potentially hypocritical view, which, like we said, these really powerful figures tend to like switch their views, or they tend to go, well, you're pressuring me to do this. Why aren't you doing it yourself? So now like they're being told by really sort of strong or powerful individuals that they're hypocritical. So like that's how we believe it impacts on social relationships. Also another one about toxic relationships. I think on both sides of the house, stigma like is insane. It's a pretty like due to the stigma, hypocrisy is a pretty like crazy allegation, or like can be pretty tense allegation, as we've mentioned. So like there's no small way to do it under either side of the house. Like so it doesn't that doesn't really make sense. Also, they like claimed like that this holds about parents. I just want to point out they said everyone has parents that like people model their behavior get their behavior from. That's just not true. Like that just falls through. Also we believe that like stigma does harm the individuals a lot more than it like can sway power of really powerful people like to not do things, because like we said, it harms your social interaction, but it also like under our side we increase the amount of like people who maybe want to be a part of a social movement because there's less stigma around it. So I think that's like our main pathway to victory is our actual like ability to increase social change, which under their side of the house, since it's status quo, like they can't really like change that. So yeah, we do believe that there is a like huge increase in that. Outside of filming.
Thank all debaters for a great debate. We're going to end the live stream once it catches up to us, but good debate, everyone, and invite you to cross the floor and shake hands and then leave the judge to make their call.
Thanks. Bye.